Today we're going to be making a plush alien. Let's talk about some of the supplies you'll need for this project. You're going to want a few pom-poms to go on the end of the antenna, 1 to 2 pipe cleaners for the antenna. These antennae can either be just the pipe cleaner itself or they can be covered in fabric. I'm going to be using 2, and these pipe cleaners are 12 inches long. You're also going to want 2 buttons for the eyes. The buttons I'm using are 12 millimeters wide. You'll also want coordinating thread and a good amount of polyfil. The fabric I chose for the body of the alien is a swirl faux fur. This is also sometimes called rose Minky because of the rosette pattern of the swirls. You'll need just a little bit more than 1/3 of a yard. You'll also need some accent fabric for the mouth, eyes, and antenna. The antenna fabric is optional. If you're planning to just use pipe cleaners, you won't need this. I'm using Minky for all 3 of my accent fabrics. You can also use fleece fabric for the body and accents. I chose to use the Minky to make the full size plush, but I'm going to be using fleece to make the smaller version. Also, as I don't want the antenna to be bulky, I'm simply going to be using 1 pipe cleaner for the antenna, and I'm not going to cover it with fabric. For the small version, I will still need 2 pom-poms for the end of the antenna and 2 buttons for the eyes. Let's make the legs. You have a couple options when you make the legs for this plush. You can have unfinished legs on your alien. You can also have finished legs. The finished legs are each sewn so that there are no raw edges visible. For the finished leg, you want to cut out 16 rectangles. Right now I'm looking at the right side of my fabric, and I'm going to fold it in half so the right sides are touching and sew along 1 long edge. I'm going to pin this in place. I usually put pins perpendicular to the strip about every 2 to 3 inches. This pin placement is usually sufficient for fleece, but I find with the swirl fur my fabric tends to slide a little bit, which can twist the legs. So to help make it even more secure, I'm going to weave some pins in going the same direction as the strip of fabric. So in between the pins that are already there, I'm just going to weave a pin in between them. I find when I double pin this way, it stays a little bit more secure and I get a better result. Now I'm going to sew along this edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've sewn along the long edge, and now I'm going to sew 1 short end. To sew the short end, I'm going to take the tube and I'm going to arrange it so that the seam allowance is in the middle, and I'm going to squish it flat. So rather than the seam allowance being on the side of the tube, the seam allowance is now arranged in the center of the tube. And I'm going to sew along this short end with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So one end has now been stitched closed and the other end is open. So now I'm going to turn the tube right side out. There are a couple ways you can do this. My favorite way is to use a pair of hemostats. These are quite long. I'll just slide the tube down to the end, pinch the bottom, and then slide the fabric off. Then I'll use the hemostats when they're closed to slide them back in and poke out the corners on the end. And one leg is finished. If you don't have hemostats, another option for turning the leg is a wooden spoon or pencil. Take the end of the leg that has been sewn and place it against the end of the wooden spoon or pencil. Grab each side of the tube and keeping that center seam in place, wiggle the fabric over the top of the spoon, sliding it down. Once it gets started, it should slide down pretty easily. Use the end of the spoon or pencil to poke out the corners. And finish turning the leg. Repeat this process until you have 16 legs. If you choose unfinished legs, you can simply cut the fabric into strips. These strips will be quite a bit thinner than the finished strips as they don't need to be sewn. When you cut the unfinished legs, they're already the correct size they're going to be at the end. Refer to the cut layout included in your pattern for sizing. To start on the body, you want the bottom front piece as well as the bottom front lining. We're going to take the lining and place it right side down on top of the bottom front. Pin it in place. If the fabric you're using is slippery and slides a lot like mine does, be sure to be generous with the pins to help it stay in place. We're going to sew along the top edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's attached, and now I'm going to set it aside. And you need the upper and lower mouth pieces. Place both pieces right side up, and you can see where we want them to align when we're done. Take the lower mouth piece and flip it right side down so that this point here matches with this point here. You'll notice that the rest of it does not line up at all. We're going to begin pinning this in place. I'm going to start with the pin in the center. I want the pin to be 1/4 inch away from the edges and the bottom of this piece. And when I poke it through on the other side, I also want it to be 1/4 inch away from the edge of the fabric here. Now that the center pin's in place, I need to start aligning this edge with this one. Because my fabric is stretchy, that makes this a little bit easier to do. Simply turn your fabric and align the two edges. And put a pin about 1 centimeter or 1/2 centimeter away from the original. If you need to, you can clip this little section right here, but keep your clip very small as we don't want to get any holes by accident. Continue aligning the edge. Just work in small sections. You can see I now have 1/2 of the lower mouth piece attached. Now I'm going to repeat the process on the other side. I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew with the lower mouth on the bottom. So I'm going to have my fabric down like this. And I'm going to start sewing here and sew along the edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And as I get towards the end, I'm just going to sew on this straight edge down this side and backstitch at the end. Then sew down this side, come down and backstitch at the end. Rather than trying to pivot, I'm simply going to cross my lines to create the point there. Make sure the fabric on the back is nice and flat. Sometimes with Minky it can tend to curl, so you want to be careful to make sure it's not curling under, so you may need to stop frequently to check. Now I'm going to check to make sure it looks nice. My stitches are a little wobbly in this section, so I may fix that. I'm just going to sew over that section again real quick. Looks like from about here down to the end I need to resew, so I'm going to do that. That looks better, so I'm going to unpick the wobbly stitches. And let's check to make sure it looks nice. Be sure to check the center point on the fur fabric to make sure that it's secure and in place. We don't want to have a hole in the center front of our doll. Let's combine the mouth with the lower front. To begin, let's flip this right side out. Flip the lining over to the other side. And here's the right side of our fabric. This is how we want our pieces to look when we finish. To connect them, take the bottom front and lift it out of the way. The raw edge of the lining piece needs to attach to the bottom edge of the mouth. I'm going to sew with the lower mouth on the bottom. I'm going to try to keep this piece flat with the seam allowance that's already been sewn pointing away from the one that I'm going to sew next. So as I sew, I may need to stop frequently to check to make sure that this piece is laying flat, because I'm going to be sewing looking at the fur fabric. The mouth is attached and we're almost done with the front. There's just one step left. For the next step, we're going to work on the bottom lip here. When we're finished, we want this lip to poke out. With the way it's constructed, if you don't do stitching here, the front of the body just slides down and pulls it flat. And then you end up with a little pucker right here at the bottom, which we don't want. So we need to join the lip together, stitching the outside to the inside at the bottom of the lip so that it stays in place and holds its shape. You can see where the lining piece is and where the front piece is, and we're folding it right at the section where they join. We're going to move our seam allowance back out of the way. So the seam allowance is going this way. The lining piece and the front piece are the same shape. We just want them to lay flat. And we're going to pin the two layers together right at the juncture where the mouth meets the lining. And I'm going to do that all the way down. So let's head to the machine and we're going to stitch in the ditch. I'm going to stitch exactly between the lining piece and the bottom of the mouth piece so that my stitches slide right in the gap in between them. If the fur fibers get in your way and you can't see where that seam is, I'm using a purple thing to help slide the fibers out of the way. You can also use the back of a seam ripper or a sewing stiletto. And now the lip is stitched together. If your stitches are very obvious, like mine are, you may want to help hide some of those stitches. You can see right now that my stitches are holding down the fibers of the fur, so you can see the thread quite a bit, and I don't want that. So I'm just going to gently pull some of those fur fibers out of the seam. The fabric of the fur is still going to be sewn together, so it will stay in position. But if you get some of the pile out of there, some of those little hairs out from underneath the stitches, they will hide those stitches for you. Use your pattern to mark the dart placement on the top of the front. Fold your fabric right sides together so that the fold is at the point of the dart. And sew along the dart line. Repeat, stitching the dart on the body back. Make sure that the lower lip is pointing up. So I'm going to pin that in place first. So here is the side of the front. Here's the lower lip. Make sure that is pointing up towards the top of the body. I'm just going to grab it and slide it up this way and place a pin at the side. I'm going to do the same on the other side. Make sure the bottom lip is pointing towards the top of the body. And pin. Place the body front piece right side up. Place the body back piece right side down on top of it. And pin on the sides and top. When I'm pinning stretchy fabrics, I like to pin key points first. So I'm going to pin the corners, top center, and I'm going to pivot the darts. I'm going to have one dart go this way and one dart go that way. And once I have the key points secured, then I'm going to pin in between. Okay, I have it pinned securely and I want to check the back. I want to make sure that the mouthpiece is laying flat. And now I'm going to sew around the sides and the top with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you sew around the edges, leave an opening to turn your plush later. And I usually start about 5/8 of an inch up from the bottom edge, and then I leave it open up until the bottom of the mouth. So I want to keep that lower lip secure. So the section that I'll keep open goes from about the bottom of the mouth to about 5/8 inch from the bottom edge. So when you sew, keep this section open. I always forget, and when I was filming this I did the same thing and just sewed all the way down, but you don't want to. You want to make sure that when you sew you leave a gap to turn later, because we're going to completely enclose the bottom when we attach the legs. Check to make sure everything looks right and is all turned out correctly. Make sure you have your opening on the side. And if you're happy with it, you're ready to attach the legs. We're going to attach the legs to the base of the body. You can see the base of the body is kind of an oval shape. We're going to add the 16 legs. There are going to be 8 legs attached to the front of the body and 8 legs attached to the back of the body. If you're using the unfinished legs, the body should be turned right side out. Place the leg right side down. Align the first leg with the side seam and make sure the raw edges line up. Then place the next leg right side down, directly next to the other. The legs should be touching but not overlap. Continue all the way around. Once the legs are positioned all the way around, baste them in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you attach the legs to the body, you're going to be attaching the open side. You want to squish the tube so that the seam allowance is open in the middle and that the seam allowance is in the center. And we're going to pinch it flat like that. If you'd like to, you can baste them closed if you prefer. I'm just going to pin them in place. The seam is going to be the wrong side of the leg, so the seam I don't want to see. So when I'm looking at my plushie, I'm going to go ahead and flip it upside down so it's easier to work with. And I'm going to place it right sides together. The side without the seam is going to be touching the front of the plush. I'm going to align the first strip with the side seam. So I'm going to find the side seam on the body and align the side of the strip with that. I will be able to see the seam on the leg and it's going to be in the middle of the strip. And I like to put 2 pins to hold it in place, one on each side of the leg. And there is a lot of fur and fluff here, so you do have to be careful to make sure that you are attaching the fabric of the fur and not just the fluff. But when we align the pieces, we are looking at the fabric, not the pile fibers. And then we're going to go ahead and position the next leg. Again, I'm going to pinch it so that the seam allowance is open and in the center, and so I see the seam. I'm going to place right side down next to the body, right next to the previous leg, and they will be touching but laying flat. You don't want them to overlap except for the little pile fibers. Again, take care to make sure the raw edges of the leg align with the raw edges on the body. And we're going to continue that all the way around. And now we're going to stitch around the base with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This can be kind of tricky as the fabric does tend to roll and there are a lot of fibers hanging off. You can hand baste this instead if you prefer. Take care to make sure you're sewing through the fabric and not just the fluff on the edge. Check to make sure all the legs are nicely attached. Make sure they hang straight and even and that nothing is tucked in the seam that shouldn't be. Flip it back right side out so all the legs are inside. Make sure the legs are stuffed all the way down in the bottom. We're going to be sewing on the base and we don't want any of the legs to be caught in the seam allowance. So let's attach the bottom. Let's prepare the base to sew to the bottom of the alien. First, lay your fabric right side down so that you're looking at the wrong side of the fabric. Then take your base pattern piece and trim it to the stitch guideline. Place your pattern in the center of the fabric. There should be 1/4 inch all the way around for the seam allowance, and then trace the pattern piece. I'm tracing this with a Sharpie, but you could also use a fabric marking tool such as an air erase marker. You'll also want to mark the top and bottom center as well as the left and right centers. Let's apply the base to the bottom of the alien. Make sure all of the legs are tucked down inside and make sure you have the opening on the side. We're going to align the left and right center points with the seams and pin in place. And then align the center front and center back center points and pin in between. Once you have it pinned in place, you have a couple options. You could go directly to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or you can hand baste it in place. I found that with this fur fabric, it tends to slide quite a bit, which can make the base lopsided or insecure, or I'll get lots of wobbles in my seam. So I'm gonna hand baste this before I sew it on the machine. That way I can check on both the bottom and the top at the same time to make sure I'm maintaining my seam allowance. I'm going to be using a contrasting thread so that it's easier to see on camera, but if you plan to leave the stitches in, you may want to use a thread that coordinates a little more. It doesn't really matter where you start, but I'm going to start on my line, which I drew on the base, so I know it's a 1/4 inch away from the edge. And I'm just going to poke it through on the other side and make sure it's also a 1/4 inch away. I'm just using a running stitch, and I'm going to make my stitches about a 1/4 inch long. I'm going to remove the pins as I go so they're out of my way. I'll continue all the way around and come back when I'm finished. Now that the base has been basted in place, I'm ready to head to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew around the edge with a seam allowance that's just a tad bigger than my basting stitches. So I'm going to sew with about a 5/16 seam allowance. You can also sew with the 1/4 inch or 3/8, either is fine. I'm going to be sewing with the base on the bottom, and as I sew, I'm going to have to push the rest of the fabric out of the way. So you do have to get a pretty good grip on it, and you do have to go slow and be patient. Make sure the base piece is flat and check it frequently as you're sewing. Check to make sure that your base is securely attached and that your stitches look nice and even. If everything looks good, go ahead and turn your plush. So I'm just going to grab some of the legs out of here and start gently pulling them out of the opening. If you're using fleece fabric, after you flip the plush, you may want to double check to make sure you can't see any of your basting stitches from the legs. Sometimes, if your stitches get a little small when sewing on the base, you can see the basting stitches from the front. Looks like mine's good, but if you do see any of those basting stitches, you may want to use a seam ripper to remove them. Fully turn out the corners, grab some polyfil, and be sure that it's light and fluffy. If the polyfil is clumped, go ahead and just break it up and fluff it a little bit before stuffing it into the doll. And keep filling with polyfil until it's stuffed firmly. Make sure you have plenty of polyfil, as it always takes twice as much as expected to fill the plush. Be sure to get the corners Once you're finished stuffing the plush, it's time to close the opening. Be sure to keep your 1/4" seam allowance and use a needle and thread to slip stitch this section closed. If you're not sure how to do a slip stitch, you can refer to my slip stitching video, which is linked in the description below. Like we did when we stitched the bottom lip seam, on the side seams, darts, and where the legs are attached, you can do the same to help gently pull the fur fibers out of the seam allowance. I'm just going to take my purple thing. You could also use a sewing stiletto or the side of a pin and just gently rub the seam allowance, helping those fur fibers to come free. The fur fabric itself is still attached. We're just bringing the pile out of the stitches, which will help hide the seam and make it blend together a little bit more nicely. If you're using fabric without a pile, this won't be necessary. When making the eyes, you want to make sure that your pieces are going the correct direction. And since they are symmetric, that can be kind of hard to do. So I'm going to test each of my fabric pieces and make sure they're going the correct way. I'm going to brush the Minky fabric so that I can see which way the fibers should go. Mine are going down this direction, so this is the top of the piece and this is the bottom. So I'm going to turn it over to the wrong side, and using an air erase marker, I'm going to mark with a T the top end. If you don't have an air erase marker, you can use a different marking tool. Just make sure your marks are on the seam allowance so you don't see them in your final project. And I'm going to repeat this for all 8 pieces. Identify the top of one of the eye pieces. Place the fabric right side up. Grab another eye piece and again identify the top. Place the 2 pieces right sides together, aligning the top and bottom points, and pin at the top point at the bottom point and along one side. Then I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew along one edge. If you prefer, you can trim your pattern piece and trace the stitch guide on the pieces if you'd like to have a more precise line to follow. But I'm going to start from the uppermost point and sew down along one edge with a 1/4" seam allowance. Repeat with all of the pieces, creating 4 sets of 2. Let's go to the sewing machine, sewing one side of each. The pieces should now be sewn together in sets that look like hemispheres. Identify the top of one set and the top of another. Open one and place it right side up. Open another and place it right side down on top of it, aligning the seams. And pin around one side. And then pin around the other, but this time leave the opening to turn the eye. I like to leave the opening along the lower half. I don't want it to go all the way down to the point because sometimes it can be tricky to sew that intersection by hand. I'm going to go about 1/2 inch away from that bottom point. Up to the side here, so this is the center point of the side, And in between the red and blue pins, I'm gonna leave it open. That is where I'm gonna turn it later. So I'm gonna start sewing at the blue pin, sew around, and stop sewing at the red pin. And I'm gonna repeat for the other set. I'm gonna be sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Turn each eye right side out. And make sure each seam is fully extended. Then stuff each eye with polyfill, slip stitch it closed, and brush the seams. You want to make sure that the eyes are stuffed firmly but evenly. So before sewing them closed, check to make sure they look like they're the same size. When you're done slip stitching, you can leave the thread and needle attached and then use it to sew the eye directly to the body of the plush. Before I do that, I'm going to brush the seams. When I place the eye on the plush, I like to place the seam that I slip stitch so that it's hidden. My slip stitching is right here. I'm going to align this seam with the side seam on the plush. I want the eye to stick above the top of the plush. I'm going to grab a couple pins to hold this in place. And I'm going to start slip stitching this in place. I'm going to slip stitch all around the base of the eye where the eye touches the body of the plush. I'm going to go all the way around, and I like to do that about 3 or 4 times to make sure it's really secure. So I just did 1 stitch on the body of the plush. And 1 stitch on the eye. And pull it snug. One stitch on the body of the plush. And 1 stitch on the eye. And I'm going to continue like that all the way around. Once one eye is attached, be careful when placing the second eye to make sure that it balances with the first. You want them to be even when you're finished, so keep an eye on that as you sew around the eye. Once both eyes are attached, then you're ready to position the pupils. These are 2 12mm buttons. You can place them wherever you like. I like to position them a little closer to the head and a little down. So rather than putting them centered on the eye, I'm going to find halfway and bring it down and in. Also take care to make sure that the holes in the buttons are going the same direction. The buttons I'm using have 2 holes, so I'm going to place them so that one is on the top and one is on the bottom. Once the buttons are in place, you can hand stitch them. I usually like to sew them in place about 3 or 4 times. I'm going to start by hiding the knot underneath the button. And I'm going to come up through the bottom hole. And then I'm going to remove the pin and go down through the top hole. And I should be able to see the position of my threads now. So I can see where the bottom thread is coming from. And so I'm going to place my needle going from top to bottom. So about 1/8 of an inch away, I'm gonna go a little higher than where my previous thread was, and then back down to the same position as the bottom. So it's a little loose and the buttons fall in a bit right now, but then once I pull it, and I'm gonna place my needle back through the bottom hole, make sure it's not twisted. And now I have it in place. I'm gonna make sure that knot gets hidden underneath there. I'm gonna wrap those threads around. And then I'm gonna go back through the top hole. And to do this, I just kind of press the bottom of the button down so that it lifts up a little on the top. And pull my thread. And then I'm gonna go down behind the button, do a little stitch through the fabric and pull it down and go up through the hole and repeat. I'm gonna do that a couple more times. And then once it feels secure, I'm gonna tie my knot. I'm just gonna make a loop, go under a little bit of fabric here, and up through the loop. I'm gonna do that a couple times. And then I'm gonna hide the knot by poking the needle under the eye and out through the side, pulling the thread under. I'm gonna pull it really tight and clip that thread. And then the end is hidden inside. And I'll repeat for the other eye. The eyes are done and I'm ready to start on the antenna. To make a covered antenna, I'm going to use 2 pipe cleaners instead of 1. And I'm going to twist them together at the ends, nice and tight. To make this a little bit more protected so that the wires don't accidentally poke out, this is just a little wire cap that I got on Amazon in the hardware section. And I'm just going to cover the ends of the wire with that. Now this is optional, you do not have to do that. You can simply just twist them together. You can also bend the ends just a little bit if you'd like to. But the plastic cap will protect it just a smidge. It will also help make it easier to slide it into the fabric later. I'm going to repeat on the other end. Let's prepare the fabric to cover the antenna. This is just a rectangle of Minky fabric. It measures approximately 2 1/4 by 15 inches. So I'm going to take this strip and I'm going to fold it in half and use a few pins to hold it in place. Now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew along the folded edge. How far away from that fold you sew can vary. The thicker the fabric, the larger the seam allowance you need. I found with fleece, you need about 1/2 inch. With Minky, 3/8 or 5/16 tends to work well. And for fabric that is not plush, you may even be able to go smaller than that. Since I'm using Minky fabric here, I'm gonna sew with about a 5/16, which is halfway in between 3/8 and 1/4. You do wanna be pretty exact with this. If you get it too big, it will look bulky or imbalanced on the alien. And if you get it too small, you won't be able to turn it. So you do wanna be careful. And if you're worried about not being able to follow a 1/16 of an inch seam allowance, 3/8 is fine. Now that it's been stitched, I'm going to trim my seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch. Be careful not to make it too small, as you don't want to accidentally get a hole. My favorite way to turn a tube is using a bobby pin. I'm gonna go to one end and I'm gonna make a little clip on the fold. I'm gonna clip about 3/8 of an inch away from the bottom edge. And so I'm clipping the folded section. I'm not going to clip my stitches. I'm just going to make a clip in the fabric. And then I'm going to place the bobby pin along that fold. So you can see the little clip section is now on the bobby pin. And then both ends of the bobby pin I'm going to place in the tube and push it in. You'll see that this end starts to tuck in. And depending on the fabric, turning this can be quite easy or quite challenging, depending on how the fabric sticks. Whichever type of fabric you choose, there's usually a little fiddling you have to do with it at the beginning to get it to go over the end of that bobby pin, and for the fabric that was on the end to start making its way inside the tube. If it's having a difficult time going over the end of the fabric there, I like to take a pin and place it through a little of the fabric that's on the outside and just lift it over. Kind of gives it the chance to start working in the correct direction. And I'll pull it a little more, and there it goes. Now the end of the fabric is all the way in the tube there, and you can see it's starting to roll inside, kind of like turning a sock. And now I can feel the bobby pin right in here inside the tube, and so I'm going to scrunch the fabric on the bobby pin. Now I'm gripping the bobby pin with my left hand, and with my right hand I'm going to grab the outside fabric and just slide it down. And then I'm going to repeat that. You want to go kind of slow. You want to be gentle. You don't want to pull it too hard or too firmly because if you pull it too much, you'll snap your stitches and then you have to start over. So just very slowly take your time, scrunch it up on the bobby pin, hold the bobby pin, and gently pull the fabric. More and more of the fabric should be turning to the inside of the tube. When you get to the point when you can finally see the bobby pin, it's tempting just to grab it and pull. I really recommend that you do not do that. Every time I've tried to just pull it once I see the bobby pin, I've snapped the stitches and had to start again. So even though you can see part of the fabric here, don't rush, hold it gently, move the fabric in small sections, an inch at a time, and just move it carefully, because if you pull it too strongly, too firmly, too far, too fast, it will snap and you don't want to have to start over. And when you get to the end, don't get in a rush because you don't want to pop the stitches the last inch or two. Just keep going slow. Now the tube is fully turned, and I'm going to cut off the end with the bobby pin. If any of the ends get frayed or messed up, you can also clip those off as well. That's why we add a couple extra inches to the end, just in case. Now I'm going to take my pipe cleaner and place it inside the tube. Some fabrics the pipe cleaners go in easily, some fabrics it really doesn't want to. So if you can't use pipe cleaners, you could always use just plain wire. Just be sure that the wire is not going to poke through the fabric. Mine, it really didn't want to go onto this end, so I'm moving it to the other side. And with the Minky, I find it slides in quite easily. The pipe cleaner is now inside, and I can feel the ends of the pipe cleaner right here. Now let's trim the ends of the tube. You want to trim about 1/4 to 1/2 inch away from the end. Depending on how thick your fabric is, you may need more or less fabric at the end. With my Minky fabric, I'm gonna trim the ends to be about 3/8 of an inch away from the end of my pipe cleaner. So here's the end of my pipe cleaner here. I'm gonna trim it off about 3/8 of an inch away. And then here's the other end of my pipe cleaner, and I'm gonna trim it off about 3/8 of an inch away. So now I'm gonna finish off the ends of the antenna with a pom-pom ball on each side. I'm gonna hand sew this in place. I'm gonna close this end and attach the pom-pom at the same time. So first I'm gonna stick my needle inside the tube, and I'm gonna have the needle come out about 1/4 of an inch away. And I'm gonna hide my thread tails down inside the tube. Then I'm gonna do a few stitches around the edge. So I'm just doing a running stitch about 1/4 inch away from the top of the edge. And once I've gone all the way around, I'm going to start tucking in the ends of the Minky, poking them towards the center of the tube. And then I'm gonna pull the thread, closing the end. When you stitch on the pom-pom, make sure you are stitching through the center of the pom-pom and not just the fluff. If you only get the fluff, it won't be secure and it could come right off. So I'm gonna take my first stitch and I'm gonna go in towards the center of the pom-pom and out about 3/8 of an inch away. And I'm making sure I'm going through the center. And then I'm just going to secure it to the top of the antenna with a series of whip stitches and back stitches. So it doesn't really have to be perfect, and there's not a certain technique you need to use. Just you want it to be secure and you want to hide your stitches if you can. But the Minky and the pom-pom are both pretty forgiving. So I just stitched through the pom-pom, and now I'm going to do a little stitch on the Minky. And I'm going to repeat that, do a stitch through the pom-pom, making sure I get the middle, pull it snug, a stitch on the Minky, and I'm going to work my way around in a circle. And repeat the process on the other side. Once the two pom-poms are attached, fold the antenna in half. This will help you to find the center point. Then shape the antenna as you like. Decide where you'd like to position the antenna on the doll. And whip stitch or slip stitch in place. I usually stitch in a pattern that's kind of like an upside down triangle. So I'll stitch around this side and across this way in between the antenna and the plush on the back of the doll. I usually go around several times. You want to make sure that this is pretty secure. Hide your knot under the antenna. Next, I'm going to show you how to do the antenna if you are not covering them with fabric. So these antennae are made with a single visible pipe cleaner. If you're using a plain pipe cleaner for the antenna, we'll need to hot glue the pom-poms in place. For the regular size plush, you'll use a 12-inch pipe cleaner. For the smaller size, you'll want to trim it down a little. I'm going to use a regular pipe cleaner for the small size plush, so I'm going to trim it to be 9 inches long. Then I'm going to take a pom-pom, place some hot glue on the end, and I'll hold it in place while it cools. After it's cooled a bit, I'm going to squeeze it a bit to work those fibers together and trim off any excess. And then I'll repeat on the other side. Then I'm going to fold the antenna in half and then shape the antenna as you like. Position the antenna on the plush and you can whip stitch it or hot glue it in place. I don't want any excess hot glue, so I'm going to whip stitch this. I'm going to start by pointing the needle down, and I'm going to go above the wire and down through the fleece and make a little stitch so that the thread tails are pointing up this way. That way they'll be hidden underneath the pipe cleaner. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing again, going down above the wire in between the bend, making another stitch and going back down. And I'll pull it tight so that the thread loops around the wire here, and I'm going to do that a couple more times. Once the base feels secure, I'm going to go up a little higher and do a whip stitch or two on each side to hold it flat against the back of the alien. And that's how you do the antenna using a single pipe cleaner and hot glue. Adjust the position of the antenna as you like. And our alien is finished. And if you're feeling up to it, maybe make the alien a friend. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Until next time, happy sewing.